Hey there, friends. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, I've got a story you're going to love. But before we settle in, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of these cozy tales. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. It's always amazing to see our little storytelling circle stretch across the globe. Now dim those lights, get comfy, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. The time before time, before the stars took their places in the night sky, before the rivers carved their paths into the land, and before even the first tree had stretched its branches toward the sun, there was only the soft hum of existence itself. A kind of dreamlike silence filled the void where nothing yet had a name. This was the time before time. In this ageless moment, the world hadn't been divided into sky and land and sea. Everything was tangled together like a woven mist of potential. Light and shadow danced with no purpose, and the winds whispered to no one. Yet, deep within this stillness, something ancient stirred. A presence, a feeling of life waiting to bloom. And from that quiet vastness came the first spark, the essence of Dan Nu, the Great Mother. She wasn't born like a person is born. She didn't have to be shaped from clay or summoned by word. Dan Nu simply was. She drifted through the formless mists like a melody without a song, filling the emptiness with her presence. Her touch gave rhythm to the chaos. She breathed meaning into silence. From Dan Nu's essence came the Tuatha De Danann, her children, or perhaps her thoughts made real. They were gods, but not the kind that sat on thrones in high castles or ruled with cold commands. No, these were gods of the land and sky and storm and shadow. They were part of the world, not above it. The first among them was the Dagda, a mighty being with a laugh as big as thunder and a hunger just as wide. He was a builder, a warrior, a father, and a dreamer. Where he walked, rivers flowed behind him. When he laughed, trees sprouted from the soil, and when he wept, his tears brought healing. He carried with him a great club that could kill with one end and bring life with the other. With him came others, Nuada, the noble warrior with a heart full of justice. Brigid, radiant with wisdom and warmth, guardian of the hearth and the poet's voice. Lir, whose moods stirred the sea itself. And Lu, the shining one, destined to hold a spear and lead gods into battle. These gods didn't sit back and observe the world. They created it. Slowly, deliberately, they took the raw mist and began to shape it into something real. The sky was stretched above like a shimmering curtain, and the land rolled out beneath like a sleeping giant's back. Rivers were painted across the earth like silver threads, and mountains were molded with strong hands and willed into place. The Tuatha De Danann gave each piece of the world its own heartbeat. Every tree whispered secrets. Every rock hummed with memory. The wind was not just air, it was a voice. The rain didn't just fall, it danced. But they didn't do this all at once. No, their creation was like a song slowly being written, each note placed with care. They wandered the new world, breathing life into what had only been formless mist. Sometimes they argued about the shape of a valley or the color of a flower. Sometimes they sang together, and their voices made entire forests spring up in a night. And in the heart of this growing world, Dan knew what. She didn't speak often, but when she did, even the stars paused to listen. Her voice was the river's hush and the whisper of grass in the wind. The Tuatha knew she was not just their mother, she was the land itself. As the world began to settle into form, time started to flow slowly, like a stream just starting to trickle from the mountains. It was not yet like time as we know it, with minutes and hours. It was more like seasons of change, a long stretch of warmth, a sudden burst of cold, a silence followed by sound. Still it was time, and it moved forward. The gods, in their joy, gave names to things. Naming was sacred. When something had a name, it belonged in the world. It had a purpose. The ocean became the Sea of Lir. The bright dawn was kissed by Brigid. Stones bore the memory of battles yet to be fought, but not all was peaceful. From the edge of the mist, something else stirred, a different kind of force. Darker, colder, the Fomorians. They were not born of Danu's warmth or shaped by her dream. They came from the shadows, born of storm and rage and deep, ancient fear. The Fomorians watched as the Tuatha made beauty from chaos, and they did not like it. They preferred the old ways, the storm without sun, the night without stars. In their eyes, the world was becoming too soft, too full of light, and so they began to creep in, unseen for now, but waiting. But the Tuatha were not afraid, not yet. They still believed the world could be held together by songs and stories, by laughter and love. They built the first halls not of stone but of song and starlight. In these places they gathered to share what they had made. The Dagda told tales that made the mountains shake with laughter. Brigid taught the first bard to rhyme the sound of the wind. In these earliest days there were no humans, no cities or kings. The world belonged only to gods and spirits and the whisper of dreams. But even then the Tuatha De Danann knew the world was not meant to stay empty. They could feel it, something more was coming, a different kind of creature, smaller than gods but full of hunger and hope. So they began to shape the land with care. Valleys where people might someday plant grain, rivers that could carry fish and dreams, hills that could watch over villages not yet born. They hid magic in the stones in case it would be needed later, and Danu, ever watching, ever silent, smiled. The world was almost ready. As the mists cleared and the stars began to truly shine, the Tuatha De Danann stood at the edge of something new. The beginning of stories, the beginning of stories, the beginning of time. They did not know exactly what would come next, but they felt it, like the first breath before a word. This was the time before time, when the gods still walked the land, when the rivers listened, and when the world itself was still dreaming. The arrival of the Tuatha De Danann. The world had slowly unfolded itself like a leaf stretching toward the sun. The rivers had settled into their beds. The trees had taken root, standing tall like quiet sentinels. The skies had learned how to carry the winds, and the winds themselves had become messengers, traveling from mountaintop to valley with whispers of stories not yet written. In this land still fresh with wonder, the Tuatha De Danann stirred. They had always been part of the world, woven into the very breath of the earth. But now came a moment when they chose to arrive, not just in spirit, but in form. They would step upon the soil, walk among the rocks and trees, and take their place in the world they had helped to shape. Their journey didn't begin from a place known by names today. The stories say they came from the 4 great cities of wisdom: Thalius, Gurius, Murius, and Findius. These weren't cities like we think of now. They were places of pure knowledge, floating between the worlds, hidden in folds of time, filled with glowing halls and halls of glowing. The air there shimmered with thought. Every stone knew a secret. Every whisper could light a fire. In those cities, the Tuatha De Danann learned the art of craft and war and magic and healing. They studied the stars and spoke with trees. They molded metal not just with heat, but with song. They gathered wisdom like berries from an ancient forest, storing it away, not for power, but for purpose. Then one day they were ready, not because they had conquered all knowledge, but because they knew that to remain still was to wither. Growth comes through movement. And so together they gathered on the edge of the other world and looked out across the sea. It was a sea not just of water, but of mist and memory. A place where the past curled around the present, like smoke from a fire. Their ships weren't carved from wood like the boats of men would one day be. They were vessels of light and enchantment, woven from spells and dreams. They didn't sail as much as they drifted, floating gently across the surface of the sea as if guided by destiny itself. The journey was long, but time moved differently for the Tuatha De Danann. Days folded into each other like pages in a book. The stars above sang to them. The moon lit their way, painting a silver path across the waves. Below, the sea whispered to them in the language of old gods and unborn worlds. When they finally reached the shores of Ireland, it was not with fanfare or trumpets. It was with quiet purpose. They arrived cloaked in mist. Some say they rode the fog itself, that the land didn't see them until they were already here. And even then the earth paused to take a breath. Their feet touched the ground gently, as if they were greeting an old friend. The trees leaned in close. The rivers shivered with delight. Birds stopped their songs for a heartbeat, then sang louder, as if welcoming the return of a familiar tune. But this land, beautiful and wild, was not empty. Another people were already here, the Fir-Bolg, a strong, enduring race, shaped by hardship, born from the soil and sea. They had tilled the land, raised their stones, and carved out a place for themselves. Their sweat was in the soil, their songs were in the hills. So when the Tuatha De Danann arrived, the Fir-Bolg saw them not as saviors, but as invaders cloaked in magic. Strangers glowing with mystery and power. They weren't entirely wrong. The Tuatha had come to share the land, yes, but they had also come to shape it in their own image. They believed in balance, but also in purpose. And their purpose was now rooted in this place. The two peoples stood across from each other, one shaped by toil, the other by enchantment. Both proud, both bound to the land. There was tension in the wind. Even the birds flew a little higher, unsure of what was about to unfold. But before swords were drawn, the Tuatha offered words. They sent messengers. They spoke of peace, of sharing, of living side by side. Yet beneath their words, even they knew they had not come this far only to be told no. The Fir-Bolg, wise in their own right, saw this. And so they too gathered. Around fires and stone circles, they whispered strategies and summoned old spirits. Finally they answered. If the Tuatha wished to claim part of the land, they would have to earn it. Not through trickery or songs, but through battle. And so it was decided. The first great battle of Ireland would be fought. The Battle of Mag Tuatha, a name that would echo across centuries. But before the clash of weapons and the cries of warriors, the Tuatha did something curious. They hid their ships, not in the forest or under the sea, but by burning. They set them ablaze with fire and song, letting the smoke rise into the sky like a promise. There would be no turning back. They would live here or not at all. Some say it was a sign of bravery, others of arrogance. Perhaps it was both. As the days passed, both sides prepared. The Tuatha called upon their magic. They summoned mists that could blind and winds that could knock a man from his feet. They sharpened their blades and their minds. They listened to the rhythm of the earth and let it guide their hearts. The Fir-Bolg prepared in their own way. They stood grounded in tradition. They called upon their ancestors. They shaped stone and wood into weapons. They sang songs of defiance and wrapped themselves in the strength of their history. Then the day came. Morning rose slowly, like a curtain being drawn back. Mist clung to the hill. The ground felt heavy, as if it too was bracing for what was to come. The two forces met at Mag Tuatha, a plain both sacred and silent. The Tuatha stood radiant, not just in armor, but in purpose. Their eyes glowed with the light of other worlds. The Fir-Bolg stood firm, not with magic, but with memory. They carried their land within them. And then, it began. What followed was a battle not just of bodies but of belief. Swords clashed like thunder. Magic sang through the air like lightning. The ground shook with the weight of decision. It was not a short fight. It stretched into days, into nights. Blood soaked the earth. Prayers were whispered to gods old and new. In the end, the Tuatha De Danann won, but it was not a victory without cost. Many of their own had fallen. Most heartbreakingly, Nueta, their king, lost his arm in the battle. And according to their laws, a king must be whole. Still, the Fir-Bolg, though defeated, were not destroyed. The Tuatha, true to their word, allowed them to stay. They gave them Connacht, a province rich with rivers and hills. And so the two peoples began the long journey toward coexistence. The Tuatha De Danann had arrived, not as shadows but as kings and queens and keepers of the land. They would build their halls, raise their stones, and write their stories into the bones of Ireland. But the world was not done shaping them, nor they it. The mist still lingered, the wind still carried warning, and in the shadows beyond the hills other forces watched. For now, though, the land was quiet, not with peace but with pause, the kind of silence that comes after the storm, just before the next chapter begins. The rise of the great kings. The dust of the battlefield had settled, but the echoes of that ancient clash lingered in the land. The Tuatha De Danann had claimed their victory, but victory always carries a price. The loss of Nuada's arm was not just a blow to a warrior, but to a king. In the lands of the Tuatha, where magic and tradition intertwined like the threads of an eternal tapestry, the rules of leadership were as old as the hills. A king to lead must be whole, both in body and spirit. And so Nuada, despite being the heart of the Tuatha, had to step aside. The crown could not rest on his brow. The laws of the land demanded that another take his place until he could return whole again. And from the ashes of battle, there emerged a new king, a king who would shape the future of the Tuatha De Danann in ways no one could have foreseen. This king's name was Bress. He was young, a striking figure with eyes as sharp as obsidian, and a presence that seemed to command the winds to listen. His bloodline was not pure Tuatha, however. His mother was a Fomorian, a being of an ancient and terrifying race from the sea, a race whose shadow had long darkened the shores of Ireland. The Fomorians were powerful, cruel, and unforgiving, with a thirst for dominion that stretched beyond the seas, beyond the lands of men and gods alike. Though he was of mixed blood, Brez was chosen by the people, for he was the son of a king. His mother's lineage was not enough to turn the Tuatha away from him, and his father's blood was strong with the craft of magic and kingship. He stepped forward as the new king, crowned under the boughs of the sacred oak, with the wind of the other world blowing through his hair and the eyes of the people upon him. For a time his reign seemed a bright one, as if the clouds had parted and the sun shone on his rule. Brez was a shrewd king, clever in speech and even more so in action. He knew how to win favor with both the common people and the noble warriors. He had a way of understanding the hearts of men and women, of seeing their needs and desires, and it was with this understanding that he gathered loyalty around him. The Tuatha De Danann began to rebuild after the battle. They raised great halls, crafted weapons of light, and filled the land with magic. It seemed like they were on the brink of something great, but Brez's reign, while initially prosperous, began to reveal cracks. The great promise of his rule started to fade as quickly as it had appeared, and it was not long before whispers began to spread throughout the lands. His Fomorian blood, once thought of as a source of power, began to show its darker side. His decisions began to favor his mother's kin, and in the courts of the Tuatha, the seeds of division were sown. The Fomorians were not a race that shared easily, and Brez, it seemed, had inherited more than just their strength. He had inherited their hunger for control. The common folk who had once cheered for his rise began to murmur of discontent. The warriors, those who had once looked upon him with respect, began to grow restless. The air, once filled with the sound of music and laughter, now hummed with tension, as if the land itself had sensed the coming storm. And yet Brez was not without allies. His mother's kin, the Fomorians, though few in number, were fierce and dangerous. They had their own magic, their own ways of bending the world to their will. They had never cared for the Tuatha De Danann's rules, their intricacies of magic, and their eternal ways. They had always viewed themselves as above such things. The Fomorians believed in power, pure and simple. They respected strength, not wisdom. And so, with the backing of his mother's people, Brez sought to bring the Tuatha De Danann into a new age, one where the old ways would be discarded and the Fomorian ways would rise in their place. But there were those among the Tuatha De Danann who would not stand for this. The warrior class led by the mighty Lug, the Shining One, who was known for his unmatched skill in battle and his deep wisdom, rallied against Brez's growing power. Lug was not just a warrior. He was a craftsman of the gods, a master of every art. His skill in battle was only surpassed by his understanding of the world. He could see the danger that Brez's rule represented. Lug knew that the Tuatha could not survive as a people if they allowed the Fomorians to dominate. It was not just a matter of power, it was a matter of survival. If the Tuatha De Danann allowed the Fomorians to lead, they would lose their magic, their songs and their ties to the earth. Their very identity would be consumed by the darkness that the Fomorians brought with them. Thus Lug called for the great gathering of the Tuatha, a council where the future of the people would be decided. The warriors gathered with their swords and the druids came with their staves, their voices low with the weight of prophecy. The sages of the land, those who could read the patterns of the stars and listen to the winds of fate, joined the gathering. All eyes were on Lug as he spoke, his words clear and strong, cutting through the tension like a blade through silk. "We cannot let the shadow of the Fomorians fall upon us," Lug said, his voice ringing with the power of his belief. "We must stand together as we always have, and protect the light of our people." His words stirred something in the hearts of those who listened. They remembered the old ways, the ways of magic and craft, of song and nature. They remembered the promise of the Tuatha De Danann, and they knew they could not let that promise be erased by the Fomorian hunger for control. A great battle was inevitable, and it would come to pass at the plains of Mag Tuad, the very place where the Tuatha De Danann had first fought for their place in the world. The air was thick with the taste of war, and the land once again would tremble beneath the feet of those who walked upon it. The battle that followed was one for the ages. It was not just a clash of swords, but a battle for the soul of the Tuatha De Danann. Lug, leading the charge, stood at the head of his warriors, his spear raised high, its light shining brighter than the sun itself. Beside him stood the greatest of the Tuatha warriors, the mighty Cuchulainn, with his strength unmatched, the beautiful Ain, whose magic could bend the very air to her will, and the wise Dagda, whose knowledge of the world was as deep as the earth itself. Against them stood Brez and his Fomorian allies, their dark magic twisting the land beneath their feet. They sought to drown the light of the Tuatha De Danann, to cast them into shadow. The Fomorians were creatures of the sea, their bodies twisted by the salt and the storm, and their magic was as wild and destructive as the waters themselves. The battle was fierce. The air was filled with the sound of clashing swords, the roar of magic, and the cries of warriors. The earth itself seemed to shake with the force of the combatants' fury, but in the end it was Lug who struck the final blow. With his spear he pierced the heart of Brez, ending his reign and shattering the Fomorian hold over the Tuatha De Danann. The land fell silent once more. The storm passed, and the sun shone once again upon the Tuatha De Danann. But the price of victory was high. The warriors who had fought so valiantly now stood, weary and bloodied in the quiet aftermath of battle. The Tuatha had won, but they had lost much in the process. Yet the lesson was clear. The Tuatha De Danann would not be ruled by darkness. They would stand as guardians of the land, as masters of magic and song, and as keepers of the balance that sustained the world. And with Lug's rise, the age of the great kings began. Lug, now crowned as king, took his place at the head of the Tuatha De Danann, not out of hunger for power but out of duty to his people. His reign would not be one of conquest, but of unity. He knew that true leadership was not about ruling with an iron fist, but guiding with wisdom and strength. And under his leadership the Tuatha De Danann flourished once more, and so the great kings of the Tuatha De Danann were born. Their stories would echo through the ages, shaping the history of Ireland and beyond. The age of the Silver Branch. The reign of Lu ushered in a new age for the Tuatha De Danann, one that was filled with prosperity and magic, yet still haunted by the echoes of past battles. The shadow of the Fomorians had been cast aside, but the Tuatha knew that the land would never truly be free of threat. The world around them was vast and untamed, and though they had triumphed over one enemy, others lingered on the horizon, waiting for their moment to strike. But for now, the Tuatha De Danann could breathe easier, for their king, Lu, was not only a warrior, but a wise and fair ruler, and under his leadership the people began to rebuild their homes, their halls, and their lives. However, despite the peace that had settled over the land, there was a quiet longing in the hearts of the Tuatha. The victory over Brez and the Fomorians had been a sweet one, but the Tuatha knew that they had sacrificed much along the way. The old ways of magic were fading, as the younger generations began to look to the future rather than the past. The druids and the sages who had once walked the land, guiding the Tuatha with their deep knowledge of the world and the spirit, found themselves growing more isolated, their ancient wisdom no longer as respected as it once had been. And so, the Tuatha found themselves at a crossroads, where the past and the future met, and where the silver thread of magic began to fray. It was in this time of transition that a great journey began, a journey that would lead the Tuatha De Danann to the heart of the other world, and ultimately to the discovery of something that would change their fate forever. It all began with a dream. The dream came to Lu one quiet evening, as he sat alone beneath the boughs of the sacred oak, watching the stars blink lazily in the night sky. He had been thinking deeply about the future of the Tuatha, wondering how they could protect their people from the threats that were sure to come, when suddenly he felt a strange pull, a sensation as if something ancient and powerful was reaching out to him from across the fabric of time itself. It was a dream, yes, but it was more than that. It was a vision, a call from the heart of the land itself, one that beckoned him to follow it, wherever it might lead. The dream was filled with light and shadows, with shapes that danced and shifted in the dark, like the flicker of a flame in the wind. At its center was a great tree, its roots stretching deep into the earth, and its branches reaching high into the heavens. The tree was ancient, older than anything Lu had ever seen, its bark shimmering with a silvery light, and its leaves glowed with a soft ethereal glow. Lu knew, without a doubt, that the tree was not of this world. It was from the other world, a place where the boundaries between the seen and the unseen, the known and the unknown, blurred like mist on a morning lake. As the dream unfolded, Lu saw something that made his heart quicken, a branch, silver and shining, hanging from the great tree. This branch was unlike anything he had ever encountered. It was not simply a branch, it was a symbol of life, of renewal, and of connection between the worlds. The dream seemed to tell him that the Tuatha De Danann needed this branch, that it held the key to their survival, and that it would lead them to something greater than they could imagine. When Lu awoke, his mind was alive with the vision, and he knew that the time had come to act. He gathered his closest advisors, the warriors and the druids, and shared the dream with them. The dream, though strange and mysterious, was not without its purpose. It spoke of a great journey to the other world, where the Tuatha would find the silver branch, and with it, the power to protect their people and ensure their place in the world for generations to come. The Tuatha De Danann, ever eager to seek out the unknown, rallied behind their king. With the strength of the warriors, the wisdom of the druids, and the guidance of Lu, they set out on their journey, traveling across the land, through the forests, and over the mountains, seeking the entrance to the other world. They passed through places that no mortal had ever seen, stepping into realms where time moved differently, and the air was thick with magic. The landscape around them seemed to change with each step, shifting from lush forests to rocky, wind-swept plains to sparkling lakes that shimmered with the light of 1,000 stars. As they journeyed deeper into the heart of the land, they came to a place where the veil between the worlds was thin, where the boundaries between the Tuatha De Danann and the other world blurred. It was here that they found the entrance, hidden beneath a great stone archway, covered in ivy and moss, as though it had been forgotten by time itself. The air around them hummed with the power of the other world, and the land seemed to breathe with life. With a deep breath, Lu stepped forward, his hand resting on the stone archway. The magic that had been woven into the world by the Ancient Ones seemed to pulse beneath his fingertips, and he could feel the energy of the land, the pulse of the earth, and the rhythm of the stars all working in harmony. He knew that this was the moment that would change everything, that this journey would not only lead them to the silver branch, but would forge a new path for the Tuatha De Danann. As they passed through the archway, the world around them seemed to dissolve, and they found themselves standing in a place beyond time, a realm of shifting lights and shadows. The air was thick with magic, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with light. The Tuatha De Danann stood in awe, knowing they had entered the other world, a place where the rules of nature and reality no longer applied. At the center of this strange realm stood the great tree from Lu's dream, its roots stretching deep into the earth, its branches reaching far into the sky. The silver branch hung from one of its boughs, glowing with an otherworldly light. It was as if the tree itself was alive, its energy flowing through the land and connecting all things together. Lu stepped forward, his hand reaching for the silver branch, and as his fingers brushed the branch, a wave of power washed over him. The magic of the other world surged through him, filling him with knowledge and wisdom beyond anything he had ever known. He could feel the connection between all things, the earth, the sky, the stars, and the very essence of life itself. The branch was not just a symbol of power, it was a conduit, a link between the Tuatha De Danann and the forces that governed the world. With it, they would have the power to protect their people, to defend the land from threats both seen and unseen, and to ensure that the magic of the Tuatha would never fade. The silver branch was not simply a gift, it was a reminder of the Tuatha's deep connection to the land, to the magic that flowed through them, and to the eternal cycle of life and death that governed the world. As Lu took hold of the branch, he felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. This was the moment that would define the future of the Tuatha De Danann, and he knew that the path ahead would not be an easy one. But with the silver branch in his hand, he felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that the Tuatha De Danann would always stand together, as they had always done, to protect their world and their people. The Tuatha De Danann returned to their lands, their spirits lifted by the power of the silver branch. They had found what they were seeking, but they had also learned something far more important, that their strength lay not in their power alone, but in their connection to the land, to each other, and to the magic that flowed through the world. And so the age of the silver branch began, an age where the Tuatha De Danann would protect the world with the knowledge and power they had gained, and where the magic of the land would continue to flow, eternally entwined with the fate of the people. The children of Danu and the rise of the Morrigan. Long after the Tuatha De Danann had secured their place in the world, a time came when the whispers of old powers began to stir once more. These powers were not born of the earth or the sky, but of the ancient and primordial forces that existed before the first breath of life. The Tuatha De Danann were the children of Danu, the great mother goddess, whose essence had shaped the very land upon which they walked. Though their people had found peace for a time, the forces that existed in the deep and forgotten corners of the world were always waiting, watching for their moment to re-emerge. And in this new chapter of their story, the Tuatha De Danann would learn that some things, once awakened, could not be put back to sleep. The children of Danu were not just divine beings. They were creatures of immense power, and their connection to the land, to magic, and to each other was the stuff of legend. They were shaped by the forces of creation itself, and their very essence carried the stories of the world in its deepest root. It was said that every time a child of Danu was born, the winds of change blew a little harder, the tides of fate shifted just a bit more, and the magic of the world took on a new form. Among the many gods and goddesses of the Tuatha, one stood apart, her story woven through the fabric of time, like a dark thread through a bright tapestry. She was known as the Morrigan, the great queen of battle, the goddess of fate, and the harbinger of doom. Her name was both feared and revered, for she embodied the destructive and regenerative forces of the world, the cycle of life and death, and the power of the land itself. While the Tuatha De Danann were known for their beauty, their craftsmanship, and their wisdom, the Morrigan was a figure shrouded in mystery and danger. Her very presence, a reminder that all things must come to an end. The Morrigan was not one to be easily understood. She was a goddess of many faces, many names, and many aspects, and she could appear in many forms. Sometimes she was seen as a beautiful maiden, with long flowing hair that seemed to catch the light of the moon, her eyes full of wisdom and ancient knowledge. Other times she took the form of a fierce crone, her face hardened by the years, her hands gnarled from holding the threads of. But more often than not, the Morrigan appeared as a raven, her wings spread wide as she soared over battlefields, her sharp gaze piercing the hearts of warriors who knew that their lives would soon be claimed by the winds of war. To see her was a sign that death was near, and many who gazed into her dark eyes would soon find themselves facing their final moments. The Morrigan was not born in the same way as the other children of Danu. Her origins were shrouded in the mists of time, Her birth a tale whispered by the wind and carried in the songs of the Druid. Some said that she was the daughter of the great goddess Danu herself, while others believed she was born of the earth and the sky, formed from the very essence of the land and its ever-changing nature. There were even those who claimed the Morrigan was not born at all but had always existed, a force of nature that had been there since the dawn of time, waiting for the right moment to reveal herself to the world. Regardless of her origins, the Morrigan was a force to be reckoned with. She had a role to play in the world, a role that no one, not even the mighty Lurk himself, could alter. Her power was not just that of destruction, it was also the power of transformation. For when the Morrigan appeared, she brought with her the promise of change, of renewal, and of rebirth. She was the goddess who ruled over the battlefields, but she was also the one who ensured that life could grow again after the bloodshed, for nothing was ever truly lost. The Morrigan was the goddess who embodied both sides of the coin, the light and the dark, the beginning and the end, the creation and the destruction, that lay at the heart of the world. As the Tuatha De Danann flourished in their lands, a new age began to stir, a time when the Morrigan's influence would grow, and her shadow would fall across the hearts of the people. She was not a goddess who sought worship or adoration, but one who sought to be acknowledged and respected for her power and her role in the cycle of existence. And it was during this time that the Morrigan's presence was most strongly felt, as the land itself seemed to shift and change with her influence. It was said that the Morrigan appeared during times of great struggle, when the Tuatha De Danann were faced with challenges that would test the very core of their being. And it was in one such moment that the Morrigan first truly revealed herself to the people of the Tuatha. The land was plagued by a new enemy, a force that none had anticipated, and it came from the east, a tribe of invaders who seemed to spring from the earth itself, their warriors as fierce and untamable as the wild winds. These invaders were known as the Fomorians, but they were not the same ones who had once threatened the Tuatha under Braz's rule. No, these Fomorians were different, more cunning, more vicious, and more determined to claim the lands of the Tuatha for themselves. The warriors of the Tuatha De Danann fought bravely, their swords flashing in the sun, their shields raised high in defense of their homeland. But they were outnumbered, and the Fomorians' relentless advance seemed unstoppable. It was then, at the height of the battle, that the Morrigan appeared. She descended from the sky like a storm cloud, her wings darkening the sun, her eyes glowing with the fire of the ancient forces. Her arrival was a sign of both hope and doom, for in her presence, the Tuatha knew that change was coming, and that the battle they were fighting was not just for land but for the very soul of the world itself. With a cry that could shake the heavens, the Morrigan raised her arms and called upon the forces of nature to aid the Tuatha. The winds howled, the earth trembled, and the sea surged, as if awakened by her voice. The Fomorians, once so confident in their victory, found themselves caught in a storm of magic and fury that they could not comprehend. The Morrigan's power surged through the battlefield like a tidal wave, her influence washing over the land and turning the tide in favor of the Tuatha. The Fomorians, disoriented and frightened, began to falter, and soon they were driven back, their warriors scattered and defeated. As the battle came to a close, the Morrigan vanished as quickly as she had appeared, her wings carrying her back into the skies. The Tuatha De Danann, their hearts heavy with the weight of their victory, knew that they owed their triumph not only to their own courage and skill, but to the Morrigan's intervention. She had given them the strength to overcome their enemies, but she had also shown them something far more important, that in the balance of life and death, of creation and destruction, they were but players on a stage far larger than themselves. In the wake of the battle, the people of the Tuatha De Danann looked to the Morrigan with new respect. She was not just a goddess of war, but a force that shaped the very fabric of existence, a being who ensured that the world would never stagnate, but would always move forward, changing and evolving with each passing moment. And so the Morrigan's presence in the world was never questioned again, for she had proven her importance, her power, and her role in the grand design of the universe. With the land now secure, the Tuatha continued to thrive, but the memory of the Morrigan's intervention stayed with them, reminding them that the world was always in motion, always changing. Life was a cycle, and in that cycle there was no beginning and no end, only the eternal flow of time and the ever-present force of the Morrigan's will. The return of the Cailleach and the turning of the seasons. The turning of the seasons was always a time of great significance for the Tuatha De Danann. For them, the rhythms of the natural world were not mere background noise. They were the pulse of existence itself. Each season brought its own magic, its own challenges, and its own promise. And the gods and goddesses who watched over the land were intimately tied to these changes. Among them, the Cailleach stood as one of the most powerful and enigmatic, a being whose very presence signaled the shifting of the tides, both of the earth and of the people. The Cailleach was ancient, even by the standards of the gods. She was the goddess of winter, the old crone who ruled over the cold months when the earth slept beneath a blanket of frost. Her name was whispered in the winds that howled across the barren hills, and her footsteps were felt in the heavy silence that fell over the land as the days grew shorter. To the people of the Tuatha, the Cailleach was both a warning and a promise. Her return each year marked the end of the long days of summer, the death of the warmth and light that had flourished in the world, and the arrival of the dark and cold time of year when the land seemed to hold its. But the Cailleach was not simply a harbinger of cold and darkness. She was a goddess of transformation, and her power lay not just in her ability to bring winter, but in her role as the keeper of the cycles of life and death. She was a goddess of the land, of the mountains, and of the earth itself. When she moved across the land, she shaped the mountains, sculpted the valleys, and carved the rivers that wound their way through the earth. It was said that the Cailleach could make the trees bend to her will, and that with a single touch, she could bring snowstorms to the highest peaks and frost to the deepest hollows. But the Cailleach's power was not without its cost. For with the coming of winter, there was always the threat of hunger, of hardship, and of death. The people of the Tuatha, like the earth itself, would grow weary in the cold months, and the warmth of the sun would seem like a distant memory. Yet, even in her coldness, the Cailleach was not without mercy. For just as winter brought death, it also brought the possibility of rebirth. The Cailleach understood that death and life were two sides of the same coin, and that in the frozen ground of winter lay the seeds of the new growth that would come with the spring. The Cailleach's reign over winter was not a permanent one, however. Her power would gradually begin to wane as the earth grew warmer, and as the sun climbed higher in the sky. And with the turning of the seasons, there came another presence to challenge the Cailleach's dominion, the goddess Brigid, the bringer of spring, the keeper of fire, and the goddess of fertility. Where the Cailleach was cold, Brigid was warm. Where the Cailleach brought death, Brigid brought life. And where the Cailleach ruled the mountains and the winter storms, Brigid ruled the fields and the hearth, breathing life into the earth as she awakened the seeds that had lain dormant in the cold ground. The battle between the Cailleach and Brigid was one that had been fought for as long as the seasons themselves. It was not a battle of violence, but of influence, as the two goddesses struggled for control over the land and its rhythms. Each year the Cailleach would fight to hold the land in her cold embrace, and each year Brigid would rise to challenge her, to bring warmth and growth to the world once again. The people of the Tuatha watched this struggle with awe, knowing that the outcome of their contest would determine the course of the year itself. It was said that the Cailleach could feel the first stirrings of spring as the days began to lengthen, and that this would drive her into a frenzy. She would race across the land, chasing the retreating snow with her icy breath, determined to hold on to the winter for as long as she could. But no matter how fiercely she fought, the warmth of the sun would always rise again, and Brigid would always return to bring the world back to life. One year, however, the Cailleach was not so easily defeated. The spring had come later than usual, and the chill of winter seemed to linger far longer than the people had expected. The fields remained barren, and the rivers ran cold and sluggish. The Tuatha De Danann, who had relied on the warmth of summer to sustain them, found themselves in a difficult position, and many feared that they would face a long and hard winter that would stretch into the months of spring itself. It was during this time of uncertainty that the Kaliak's true power was felt most strongly. She had claimed the land for herself, and the Tuatha could do nothing but watch as the earth lay frozen beneath her touch. But even in the face of such adversity, the gods did not give up. The Tuatha De Danann knew that in the end it was the turning of the seasons that would bring the change they needed. And so they called upon the great god Lug, the god of light, who had once brought victory to their people in the battle against the Fomorians. Lug, who carried the power of the sun itself, answered their call. He stood tall and radiant, his golden hair shining like the first rays of dawn, his eyes full of the fire that could melt the ice and restore warmth to the land. With Lug's help, the Kaliak's hold on the land began to weaken. The sun's rays broke through the clouds, and the earth slowly began to thaw. The cold winds of winter began to ease, and the rivers began to run freely once again. It was said that as Lug raised his spear to the heavens, the Kaliak, seeing that her time had come, retreated into the mountains where she would wait until the next winter to once again try to claim dominion over the land. With the Kaliak's retreat, Brigid was free to work her magic, and the world began to bloom. The trees that had been bare for so long began to sprout new leaves, the flowers began to push through the thawing ground, and the animals that had hibernated through the long winter came out of their dens to greet the warmth of the sun. The Tuatha De Danann rejoiced, for they knew that the battle between the Kaliak and Brigid was not just a battle between two goddesses, but a symbol of the eternal cycle of life and death that governed the world. The Kaliak would return again, of course, as she always did, and the cycle of the seasons would turn once more. But for now, the Tuatha De Danann could bask in the warmth of the sun, knowing that they had witnessed the triumph of spring over winter, of life over death. And they knew deep in their hearts that the land would always be in motion, always changing, as long as the Kaliak and Brigid continued their eternal dance. The Morrigan's shadow. There was always something different about the air. When the Morrigans stirred, the winds got a little sharper, the birds flew a little higher. Even the bravest warriors found reasons to look over their shoulders more than usual. You couldn't really explain it to someone who hadn't felt it. The way the light dimmed just a little earlier, the way the forest grew quiet at the wrong time of day. When the Morrigan walked among the hills, something in the world remembered to be afraid. The Morrigan was not a goddess who sought admiration or followers. She didn't care for songs sung in her honor or offerings left at her shrines. No, she wasn't like Brigid or Danu, who brought warmth or wisdom. She was something else entirely, older, darker, and harder to understand. She was the goddess of war, fate, and death, but not death like the gentle slipping away of old age. She was the kind of death that came screaming, wrapped in chaos and steel, with blood under its fingernails. No one really knew where she came from. Some said she was born of the first scream heard in the world. Others claimed she rose from the mists when the earth first drank blood. Whatever the truth, the Morrigan had been around longer than anyone could say. Even the oldest of the Tuatha De Danann spoke of her with a kind of nervous respect. She was part of the land, woven into its bones like deep roots. And when she came, she always came for a reason. That year, the Tuatha De Danann had grown comfortable, perhaps too comfortable. The fields had been kind, the skies had stayed quiet, and there hadn't been a real battle in seasons. There was a feeling, in fact, that peace might actually last. But peace, for all its sweetness, has a way of making people forget. Forget the price they once paid for it. Forget the gods who kept watch while they slept. And so it was that the Morrigan returned, not in anger, but in necessity. The world had grown too still. Something had to stir. Something had to bleed. She didn't announce her arrival. That wasn't her style. Instead, strange things started happening across the land. Crows, more than anyone had seen in years, gathered in great swirling clouds. They circled fields, perched on rooftops, watched from treetops. Warriors started dreaming of black wings and rivers of blood. Horses reared for no reason. Dogs howled at nothing. And then people began disappearing. Not many, just enough to notice. A messenger gone missing between two hills. A blacksmith's daughter vanishing into the morning. A druid found dead with his face turned toward the sky, eyes wide in terror. At first, no one said her name, saying it felt dangerous, like it might call her attention. But eventually someone did. And once her name had been spoken aloud, Morrigan, there was no going back. The Tuatha De Dan gathered, their leaders called into council. Lo came, his spear wrapped in cloth, eyes wary. Nawada stood beside him, silver arm gleaming, frowning in thought. The Dagda, massive and weary, leaned on his club, and among them the whispers circled. What had they done? Why had she returned? But there were others who understood her presence differently. The Morrigan, after all, didn't just bring death. She brought prophecy. She brought warning. It was said that she appeared first to a young warrior named Kay. He was alone in the hills, training with his sword beneath a sky bruised with storm clouds. The moment was quiet, the kind of stillness that feels heavy. Then he heard it, the flutter of wings. He turned and there she was. She wasn't what he expected. No terrifying vision, no bloody face or cracked nails. She looked like a woman, a sharp woman, yes. Eyes dark as ravens, hair tangled like the woods, but not monstrous. Not yet. Kale, she said, and the way she said his name made him drop his sword. You have a choice, she continued. You can stay here in this quiet place. Pretend the world does not, or you can go to where the storm brews. There you will find what is coming, and there you may stop it, or die trying. Kale asked her what was coming. She didn't answer. The Morrigan was not seen again for many days after that, but her presence remained like the echo of thunder after lightning. And as Kale ventured deeper into the forests and mountains, he found signs, stone altars cracked in half, ancient symbols drawn in ash, dreams that clung to his skin like frost. He met others too, warriors, seers, travelers, each of them drawn by a feeling they couldn't explain, and all of them had seen her. Not always in the same form, not always in the same place, but she was there, in their dream, their fears, in the corner of their eye when they weren't sure if they were alone. It became clear that the Morrigan wasn't there just to scare them. She was trying to show them something, warn them. Something ancient was waking, something even older than her, and this perhaps was the greatest fear of all. Because if the Morrigan, goddess of war, blood, fate and endings, was afraid, then the world should be too. Sky darkened a little more each day, and the Tuatha De Dan began to prepare not just for battle but for something stranger. A test, a reckoning. The Morrigan's shadow stretched across the land, and her voice echoed in the hearts of those who listened. The wheel of fate was turning again, and she, as always, was the one spinning it. The prophecy of Cath Mage Toyard. The land was still, but the stillness wasn't peaceful. It was that heavy, choking silence before something loud and terrible. The kind of quiet that makes animals nervous and clouds sit low in the sky. Everyone, mortals, gods, and creatures in between, could feel it. Something was coming. Word had spread. There was to be a great battle, a war unlike anything the people of Aerie had seen before. And at the heart of this storm stood a field, vast and shadowed, Mage Toyard, the plain of towers. But long before a single sword was drawn, the battle had already begun. Not with weapons or cries of rage, but with vision, with dreams and riddles and whispers in the wind. And at the center of it all, as usual, stood a prophecy. Prophecies were never rare in the old days. The land was thick with magic. People had strange dreams after drinking from the wrong spring or walking barefoot through mist. But this prophecy was different. It didn't come from a druid or some half-sane bard. It came from deep within the otherworld itself. It started with the Dagda, that massive, wise, endlessly hungry god who seemed to know too much and eat too loudly. One evening, he wandered alone near the edge of the river Unius. It was one of those dusky hours when the light goes silver and the shadows grow long and strange. He wasn't expecting company, but the Morrigan was there, waiting. She stood in the shallows, barefoot, her cloak fluttering even though there was no wind. Her hair looked darker than usual, like it had soaked in ink. She didn't speak right away. She never— "You've come to warn me," the Dagda said. "Not a question, just the truth." "Yes," she said. And then she told him about the Fomorians, those ancient, twisted beings who were rising again. About Bala of the Evil Eye, a monster who could kill with just a glance. About a war that would shake the foundations of the world. She told him that blood would flow like rain, that a king would fall, that not everyone standing now would be standing when it ended. But then came the part that chilled him. Not the war, not the death. The prophecy said a child of light would rise, a warrior who could turn the tide, someone with fire in his bones and destiny in his shadow, but only if he reached the battlefield in time. The Dagda listened, nodded, then he did what any worried father figure would do. He left to find the boy. That boy, of course, was Lug. Now Lug wasn't just any warrior. He was, how to put it, annoyingly gifted. He had a talent for everything. No, really everything. Music, beautiful. Craftwork, flawless. Magic, sure. Combat, don't even try. If there was a contest, Lug didn't just win. He invented new ways to win. But even someone like Lug had doubt, especially when a prophecy painted him as the only hope in a war that might destroy everything. He had grown up hearing whispers of his heritage. Son of Chion, grandson of Bala. Yes, that Bala. The monster king of the Fomori Fafriad. It was ironic, really. The one destined to destroy the Fomorians shared blood with their worst. But blood wasn't everything. Lug had been raised by the Tuatha Danann, taught by the best of them, trained not only in battle but in poetry, healing, strategy, and even farming. They called him Samil Danak, the many-skilled one. When the Dagda found him, Lug was carving a flute from ash wood, humming to himself like nothing in the world could go wrong. The Dagda dropped a bag of apples, sat down, and gave him the news. "You've got a prophecy hanging over your head," he said, "and a war coming fast." Lug sighed. "Do I get to finish this flute?" "Depends how long it takes you to kill a giant with one hand tied behind your back," the Dagda replied. That's how Lug came to lead the Tuatha De Danann. Not by birthright, not by demand, but because when the moment arrived, he stood taller than anyone else. The prophecy had awakened something in all of them. The Tuatha De Danann began gathering in earnest. Warriors from every province answered the call. Even the land seemed to hum with anticipation. Meanwhile, the Fomorians moved. Their ships darkened the sea. Their armies marched with strange beasts, twisted steel and eyes that gleamed with old hunger. Bala stood at their front, massive and cruel, his one eye covered by a heavy lid, sealed with magic. Because if it opened, well, everything died. The Morrigan watched it all unfold. She didn't join one side or the other. She never did. She walked between fate and freedom, and when the time was right, she would speak again. And so the armies gathered. Meg toured once a quiet stretch of green, became a cauldron. Spears clashed in practice. Shields were polished until they caught the rising sun like fire. Spells were whispered. Plans were made. But under it all, one truth held everything together, the prophecy. Some believed in it fully. Others quietly feared it. A few thought it was nonsense. But no one ignored it. And Lug in the center of it felt the weight of it every time he drew breath. There was one night, just before the final dawn, when he couldn't sleep. He stood at the edge of the field, looking up at the stars. That's when she came, Morrigan again, quiet as breath. "Do you believe it?" he asked her. She didn't answer right away. "Prophecies are threads," she said finally. "Some are strong, some snap. You can't know which until you pull." And then she was gone. That was the final word before battle. The prophecy stood. The boy was ready. And the war silent no more was about to roar. The fall of the Tuatha De Danann. It was a time of shadow and wind, when legends drifted across the green hills like ghosts whispering old tales. The Tuatha De Danann, once proud and shining, were beginning to fade from the world of men. Their glory still echoed in the stones and rivers, But change was coming. A new people had landed. The Milesians. The Milesians were not gods, nor were they monsters. They were humans, explorers and warriors from faraway Spain, descendants of Milespini. But they came with purpose, and their arrival was not by accident or fate, it was ambition. They wanted Ireland for themselves. Before we dive into the storm that followed, let's pause for a moment and take in the mood of the land. The Tuatha De Danann had ruled for generations. Their magic ran deep. They had brought knowledge, healing, music, and craftsmanship. They weren't just rulers, they were part of the very soul of Ireland. Trees grew more vibrant in their presence. Streams whispered secrets to them. And the people, those who lived under their rule, had both fear and love for them. But like all things, even magic reaches a turning point. The Tuatha De Danann knew the Milesians were coming. And deep down, they knew this was the final test. Now the Milesians didn't arrive in one giant wave. Their journey was long and full of omens. They had heard of the land of Ireland through myth and memory. Guided by dreams and ancient stories passed down from Miller himself, they sailed across treacherous waters, weathering storms that seemed unnatural. It was said the Tuatha De Danann tried to stop them even then, stirring the seas, twisting the winds. But still the Milesians reached the shores. When they landed, they met three queens, Banba, Fodla, and Eri. These queens weren't just rulers, they were goddesses, guardians of the land itself. The Milesians asked for permission to settle. Each queen in turn gave her blessing, but with a condition. The Milesians must name the land after. Banba and Fodla were honored, but it was Eria's name that endured. And so, Ireland Eria was born. But don't be fooled by those peaceful beginnings. A storm was brewing. The Tuatha De Danann, led by the Dagda, Lug Nuada, and the ever-wise Dano herself, were not about to give up their home without a fight. The leaders of both sides met on neutral ground. It was there that Imogen, a bard and druid of the Milesians, stood and sang a poem to the land itself. This wasn't just a performance, it was magic. His words were a binding song asking the land to accept his people. And the land listened. Still a battle had to be fought. The Milesians were asked to retreat beyond the ninth wave and try to land again if they could. It was a magical test. The Tuatha De Danann believed the storm would send them away for good. But Imogen, wise and connected to the elements, calmed the sea with his words. His poem is still remembered by bards to this day, a song that tames nature itself. They returned stronger than before, and the final war began. The battles were fierce and soaked with both blood and enchantment. Great warriors fell on both sides. Nuada, the silver-armed king of the Tuatha De Danann, fought bravely but was slain. Lug, the brilliant, many-skilled god, fought with the ferocity of the sun, but even he couldn't hold back the tide. Eventually, the Tuatha De Danann knew their time had come. They would not rule over the land anymore, but they didn't die. No, the Tuatha De Danann were far too powerful to simply vanish. They made a decision that would shape Irish mythology forever. They disappeared underground, not literally at first, but spiritually. They withdrew from the physical world and chose to live beneath the hills in the hollow mounds known as the sea. These became the entranceways to the other world, a place of beauty, wonder, and everlasting life. The Tuatha De Danann transformed into the Our Sea, the fairy folk, the hidden people. Some say they still dance under the moonlight, appearing only to those with a touch of magic in their blood or madness in their minds. Above ground, the Milesians claimed the land, but even they knew that the Tuatha De Danann were not truly gone. They left offerings, built stone circles, and told stories just in case the old gods were listening. And here's the thing, the fall of the Tuatha De Danann wasn't really a fall. It was more like a retreat. They didn't vanish in defeat. They evolved. They moved from rulers to spirits, from kings and queens to legends and protectors. That's the strange and beautiful thing about Irish mythology. It's never black and white. It's mossy and layered, like the forests of the West. The gods didn't die. They just stepped into the mist and let the next chapter begin. So if you ever walk through the hills of Ireland and feel a strange pull, a soft melody you can't explain, maybe you've stumbled close to the sea, maybe the Tuatha De Danann are watching you, or maybe they're inviting you in for just a moment to remind you that magic never really disappears. It just hides. The hidden world of the AOC. After the Tuatha De Danann stepped away from the surface of the world, it didn't mean they disappeared completely. In fact, their presence grew more mysterious, more enchanting, and more deeply woven into the roots of Ireland itself. The people still felt them. They still left gifts at ancient trees. They still whispered thanks before crossing certain rivers or walking into misty woods. The Tuatha had gone underground, not in defeat, but by choice. They slipped into the hidden folds of reality, a world parallel to our own, known as the other world. This place wasn't hell, nor was it exactly heaven. It was something else entirely, a realm of eternal youth, beauty, and powerful enchantment, and it was guarded by the AOC, the people of the mounds. Let's slow down and imagine this hidden world for a moment. Picture green hills rolling across the countryside. You pass one that's just a little too perfectly shaped, smooth like a whisper. Maybe there's a strange silence as you walk past it. No birds, no breeze, and your grandmother's voice echoes in your mind. Don't step too close to the fairy hill. Those hills, those are the sea, the entrances to the other world. Not everyone can see the doorways, and not everyone should. But for those rare moments when the veil thins at twilight at Samhain or deep in dreams, the hidden world shimmers into view. The AOC, or the sea, as some call them, are the evolved Tuatha De Danann. Still divine, still powerful, but no longer gods of war and ruling. Now they are guardians of nature, mischief makers, lovers of beauty and balance. They can be kind, or they can be terribly cruel. Time works differently where they live. A night spent dancing in their halls could mean 100 years passing in the mortal world. There are tales of poets, warriors, and even curious shepherds wandering into a sea mound and returning to find their village gone, crumbled into moss and memory. So who are the AOC really? Let's peek inside their realm. Imagine a palace made not of brick or wood, but of light and song. Trees with silver leaves whispering in a language older than time. Feasts laid out with honeyed fruits and golden bread that never rot, never lose their warmth. Music floats in the air, soft, sad, and perfect. There is no hunger, no aging, and no pain. But there is always caution, because once you eat their food, drink their wine, or dance to their music, you are bound. You may never return home, or if you do, it won't be the same. Your family will be dust. Your village will be gone. That's the deal whether they tell you or not. The AOC have many faces. Some look just like you or me, only more graceful, more impossibly beautiful. Others shift and shimmer, changing shape like the wind. They might appear as deer with golden eyes or tall women wrapped in cloaks of green mist. And then there are the darker ones, those who rarely speak, who dwell in the corners of dreams and shadow. Let's talk about a few of them. There's Ain, the fairy queen of summer and sovereignty. She's both radiant and fierce, associated with the sun and fertility. Many still say that if you see the sun glow a little brighter over Loughgar, she's walking nearby. And then there's the Banshee, or Banshee. Not evil but eerie. Her wail is a warning that someone will die. She doesn't cause the death, she just announces it. Some families are even said to have their own personal banshees weeping softly on the wind when a loved one is about to pass. There are the lean sheaf, too, fairy lovers who inspire poets and art. They give creativity beyond imagining, but always at a price. Their human companions often burn bright, then fade too soon. And don't forget the Puka. These shape-shifting tricksters could bless your farm with fertility or lead you off a cliff, depending on their mood. They might appear as a dark horse, a sly fox, or even a talking goat. Best to be polite if you meet one. But here's something important. The AOC aren't exactly good or bad. They're other. They follow their own rules. What they care about is balance, respect, and the old ways. They like offerings, milk poured at the doorstep, bread left under a tree, a bit of your harvest saved in thanks. They don't ask for worship, just remembrance. And those who forget, well, stories have been told. There was once a farmer who cut down a fairy thorn tree to make room for more pasture. Everyone warned him. The tree stood alone just off the center of a field and had been there for centuries. But he laughed, said it was just wood and leaves. The very next day his cattle scattered into the bog. His tools rusted overnight, and his child took ill with a strange fever that no healer could. Desperate, the farmer built a tiny altar where the tree had been, left out cream and bread every night, and whispered apologies into the dark. Eventually the fever broke. The cattle returned, but he never touched another lonely tree again. It wasn't fear that guided people to respect the AOC, it was awe. These weren't just spirits, they were the memory of gods, the breath of a land that remembered what it was before humans tilled its soil. As Christianity spread across Ireland, the tales of the AOC didn't vanish. They adapted. Some monks wrote them down, trying to trap their magic in parchment. Others tried to demonize them, calling them fallen angels or mischievous devils. But the people didn't quite buy it. The fairy hills still stood, the old songs still floated over the valleys at dusk, and people still looked twice before tossing a stone into a still pond. Even today, in the age of screens and satellites, the AOC haven't truly left. Stories are still told. Roads have been rerouted to avoid fairy trees. Children still make fairy gardens without knowing exactly why. Because something lingers. Maybe it's just memory. Maybe it's myth. Or maybe, just maybe, the Tuatha De Danann are still here, watching, waiting, walking between the cracks in our reality. If you find yourself in Ireland one day, standing before a quiet hill under a sky full of stars, and you hear soft laughter on the wind, don't follow it. Or do. But know this, the AOC owe you nothing. They aren't here to save you or punish you. They are what remains when gods grow quiet and become legend. And their world, their shimmering, strange, beautiful world, is never far from ours. All it takes is a moment, a whisper, a forgotten part. The Christian cloak over ancient myths. As time moved forward, Ireland didn't stand still. The land of misty legends, hilltop mounds, and shimmering gods began to hear a different kind of tale. One that came not from the whisper of the wind or the flicker of firelight, but from crosses raised on Uchan hills, and from voices reading from books older than the island's own stories. Christianity had arrived. Now, Christianity didn't sweep across Ireland like a conquering army. It didn't roar in with swords or burn the old ways into ash. No, it came quieter, like dew on the grass. It was carried by gentle monks, cloaked in wool, soft-spoken and barefoot, who offered not thunder, but peace. They carried manuscripts, not weapons, psalms instead of spells. One of the most well-known among them was Saint Patrick. You've probably heard of him, the guy with the snake, the green cloak. But behind the symbols and parades lies a man whose arrival truly marked the beginning of something big. He wasn't the first to bring the Christian message to Ireland, but he was the one who left a lasting mark. When Patrick preached, he didn't shout down the old gods. He didn't tell people they were fools for believing in the Tuatha De Danann or the AOC. Instead, he spoke in ways they understood. He walked through sacred groves. He respected the land's rhythms. And instead of calling the old beliefs evil, he offered something new, yet strangely familiar. And here's where things get really interesting. Rather than erasing the myths, the early Christian monks began to write them down, not to preserve them out of love for the old ways, but because they were fascinated. They could see the power these stories had, the way they connected people to the land, to their past, and to something bigger than themselves. So they gathered tales, long, winding stories passed from mouth to mouth by bards and grandmothers, and they inked them onto vellum. That's how we got things like the Book of Invasions, or Lebar Gabalae in. Imagine this, an ancient Christian scribe, sitting in a cold, candle-lit cell, carefully copying down the story of gods who rode clouds and flung light. But here's the twist. While they wrote, they also changed. Just a little here, a little there. They added a Christian lens to the tales. Suddenly, the Tuatha De Danann weren't gods anymore. They were ancient people, maybe fallen angels, maybe gifted humans. Their glory was something that came before the light of Christ. Impressive, yes, but no longer divine. Take the Dagda, for instance. Once he was the big-hearted, big-bellied god who could control time and weather. After the Christian touch, he was more of a wise chieftain, still powerful, but not quite a deity. Same with Bridget. She was transformed into Saint Bridget, a Christian saint with a feast day on February 1st, which just happened to align with Imbolc, her pagan festival. Coincidence? Probably not. This blending wasn't malicious. It was strategic. The monks knew that people wouldn't give up their gods overnight. But if those gods could be softened, made human, or saint-like, the transition would be gentler. Less of a break, more of a weave. So Ireland didn't just go from pagan to Christian, it became something uniquely in between. Churches were built beside fairy hills. Sacred wells that once belonged to goddesses became holy sites dedicated to saints. The triple spiral of ancient carvings found its echo in the Christian Trinity. And people they didn't forget, not really. They still left offerings at the foot of ancient trees. They still told stories about the sea on long winter nights. Only now, they also lit candles in chapels and recited the Lord's Prayer. Imagine a household in, say, the 9th century. A mother might tell her child the tale of Cuchulainn by the fire, his fierce battles, his tragic end. Then she'd tuck him in and whisper a prayer to Saint Michael for protection. The old and the new lived side by side. Not always comfortably, but somehow it worked. This fusion gave rise to something remarkable. A kind of double vision. Irish people could see the world through both a mythic and a sacred lens. A fairy ring wasn't just a natural oddity, it was a doorway. But it was also something to be avoided on the way to Sunday Mass. The bards changed too. Once they were the keepers of myth, now they became poets of faith, singing hymns and praising saints. But if you listened closely to their words, you could still hear the rhythm of the old stories. Still hear the names of places that held magic. Still hear the beat of a drum that called back to a time before time. This cultural blend created a literary legacy unlike any other. The old sagas survived, not just as relics but as living works of art. Heroes like Fionn Macumhal still roamed the forests of the mind. Warriors still loved and lost. Gods still whispered beneath the hills, even if they were now called something else. And the monks, they became gatekeepers of both worlds. They didn't always understand the stories they wrote down. Sometimes they got the names wrong or added strange interpretations. But they preserved them, and for that we owe them everything. Thanks to those scribes we still have the Tain Bo Ku Emge. We still have the stories of Deirdre, of the sorrows of Luke's brilliance, of the children of Lear, and their sorrowful swans, all captured in careful ink, on fragile pages, guarded by monks who knew they were holding something powerful. And over time, something even more surprising happened. The Christian and the Celtic began to speak to each other, not just in conflict but in harmony. The mysticism of the Celts, their deep love for nature, their respect for cycles and seasons, their sense that the divine lived in rivers and trees found echoes in the writings of early Irish saints. Saint Kevin, who prayed with birds perched on his arms. Saint Kieran, who blessed animals and lived with them like family. It was as if the land itself wouldn't let the old ways die. Even today you can feel that duality, a country of churches and ancient ruins, of holy wells and fairy forts, of Mass on Sunday and stories of banshees passed from grandmother to grandchild. Ireland didn't just Christianize, it transformed. It wove a new story using the threads of the old, and so the Tuatha De Danann never fully vanished. They just shifted shape. Their power whispered from under cloaks of scripture and psalm. They became part of the spiritual DNA of a land that has always refused to forget. The AOC, once gods, once warriors, now watched from the hills and the wind. They didn't mind the churches so long as people still remembered their names. And they were remembered through the stories, through the song, through the laughter around the hearth and the quiet prayers beside ancient stones. Because in Ireland, mythology isn't dead. It never was. It simply learned to wear a new face. The echoes of the old ways. Ireland, with its rolling green hills and misty landscapes, has always been a land where the past and present intertwine. Even as the Christian faith took root, the old beliefs didn't simply vanish. They lingered like echoes in the wind, whispering tales of ancient gods and heroes to those willing to listen. The people of Ireland found themselves living in two worlds. By day they attended church services, recited prayers, and observed Christian rituals. But by night, around the hearth, they told stories of the Tuatha De Danann, the sea, and the many other beings that had once roamed the land. These tales were not just entertainment, they were a connection to a time when the world was filled with magic and wonder. One such story that persisted through the ages was that of the children of Lear. It told of a king's children transformed into swans by a jealous stepmother, cursed to wander the lakes and rivers of Ireland for 900 years. Their tale was one of sorrow and endurance, but also of hope and redemption. Even as Christianity spread, the story was adapted, with the children's eventual salvation coming through the ringing of a Christian bell and their baptism by a monk. This blending of old and new beliefs allowed the tale to survive, resonating with generations of Irish people. Similarly, the legend of Deirdre of the Sorrows continued to be told. Deirdre, a woman of unparalleled beauty, was prophesied to bring about great tragedy. Her love for Nawise led to betrayal and bloodshed, culminating in her own tragic end. The story served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of desire and the consequences of defying fate. Yet it also highlighted the enduring power of love and the human spirit's resilience. These stories and many others were passed down through generations, often orally, preserving the rich tapestry of Irish mythology. Bards and storytellers played a crucial role in this, weaving tales that combined elements of the old pagan beliefs with the newer Christian teachings. This fusion created a unique cultural identity, one that embraced both the mystical and the spiritual. In rural communities, traditions rooted in ancient beliefs continued to thrive. People left offerings at sacred wells, believed to be inhabited by spirits or saints. They avoided disturbing fairy forts, fearing the wrath of the sea. Festivals like Samhain, marking the end of the harvest season, were celebrated with bonfires and rituals, even as they were reinterpreted through a Christian lens. The landscape itself bore witness to this blending of belief. Ancient stone circles and burial mounds stood alongside churches and monasteries. Holy wells once dedicated to goddesses were now associated with saints. The natural world remained a source of wonder and reverence, bridging the gap between the old gods and the new faith. This coexistence wasn't always seamless. Tensions arose as the Christian church sought to suppress what it deemed pagan practice. Yet, the resilience of the Irish people ensured that their ancestral stories and traditions endured. They found ways to honor both their heritage and their faith, creating a rich cultural mosaic that celebrated the complexities of their identity. In literature, the influence of Irish mythology persisted. Writers and poets drew inspiration from the ancient tales, reimagining them for new audiences. The works of W.B. Yeats, for example, often incorporated elements of Irish folklore, exploring themes of mysticism and the supernatural. These literary endeavors helped to keep the myths alive, ensuring their relevance in a rapidly changing world. Today, the echoes of the old ways can still be heard. Festivals celebrating Celtic heritage, storytelling events, and the continued reverence for sacred sites all attest to the enduring legacy of Irish mythology. The stories of gods, heroes, and magical beings continue to captivate imaginations, reminding us of a time when the world was filled with wonder. In embracing both their ancient traditions and their Christian faith, the people of Ireland created a unique cultural identity, one that honors the past while looking to the future. The old gods may no longer be worshipped, but their stories live on, woven into the very fabric of Irish life.